I stood at the edge of the ballroom, clutching the small, worn-out gift box I'd brought for my son's wedding. The chandeliers above sparkled like diamonds, and laughter filled the air, laughter that wasn't meant for me. I'd spent years imagining this day, seeing my boy in a tuxedo, smiling as he started his new life. But as I watched him across the room, his arm around his new bride, something inside me broke. "Who invited him dressed like that?" someone whispered. "I thought the staff were done serving," another laughed. And then, her voice, clear, sharp, cruel. "Mommy, why is that poor old man standing near the cake?" she said. Her laughter echoed through the hall. The bride, my son's bride, looked right at me with disgust. My son didn't say a word. He lowered his eyes and turned away. In that moment, every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every drop of sweat that built his life, it all turned to ash. But I smiled. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. Because deep down, I knew something they didn't, something that would turn their laughter into silence. They called me poor that night, but before the evening was over, they'd begged to take those words back. Before that wedding, before the laughter that cut me like a knife, my life was simple, quiet, but full of meaning. I wasn't a rich man, not by the world's standards, but I was rich in something far greater: love, pride, and hard-earned peace. I raised my son alone after losing my wife in a car accident when he was barely 5. That night, when I saw his little hands clutching her old scarf, I made a promise that I'd give him a life she'd be proud of. And I kept that promise every single day. I worked from sunrise to sunset on construction sites, breaking my back so he could go to a better school. When other fathers slept, I drove taxis at night just to pay for his textbooks. There were nights I went hungry so he could have a full plate of food. And when he got sick, I sold my only watch, the one my wife had given me, to buy his medicine. I still remember his laughter the day he learned to ride his bike. His eyes lit up like sunshine, and for a moment, every ache in my body disappeared. That smile was my reward, better than any paycheck. We lived in a small house, but it was filled with warmth. On weekends, I'd cook pancakes. They were never perfect, but he said they were the best in the world. I kept his drawings taped to the fridge, even when the edges curled and faded. Each one was a reminder that all my struggles were worth it. When he grew older, I supported his dreams: college, internships, every new ambition. Even when money was tight, I never told him. I'd rather he thought we were fine than see him worry. I wore the same jacket for years, not because I couldn't buy another, but because his happiness always came first. As time passed, the house grew quieter. He got busy with his career, new friends, and eventually her, the woman who'd later call me poor. But even as distance grew, I still checked my phone every night, waiting for his call. Sometimes it came, sometimes it didn't. Still, I never complained. Because that's what fathers do. We love in silence, we give without asking, and we endure without applause. I didn't need gratitude, I just wanted respect. A simple "thank you, Dad" would have been enough. But instead, what I got was laughter. And that laughter, cruel and careless, would awaken something in me I never knew I had. A side of me that refused to stay quiet any longer. The betrayal didn't arrive all at once. It was a slow, grinding thing, like water wearing away stone. It began months before the wedding, in the small silences on the other end of the line. "Hey, Dad, I'm busy," he would say more and more. Then, "We'll catch up later," which never came. At first I told myself he was building a life. I told myself it was normal. I believed the lie because I wanted to. The invitations arrived printed cold and formal. Mr. Thomas. No Dad, no scribbled note, just a typed name. When I asked him about it, he shrugged and said, "We had to keep the guest list small. You know how it is." His voice was careful, measured. I heard the distance in it like static on a radio. "Small," he said, as if I were an outsider to the most important day of his life. On the day, The first sting came before I even stepped out of my car. A woman at the valet glanced at me, then at my jacket, and smiled with pity, like she'd seen a stray dog. "Are you with the catering?" she asked loud enough for others to hear. Laughter followed, low and nasty, like vultures circling. I felt my face go cold, then hot, then empty. I wanted to tell them I was his father. I wanted to say my name. The bride's mother studied me as if examining a flaw. Oh, how sweet. He showed up. Her eyes were knives. When I reached the table, the groom, my son, leaned in and hissed, "Dad, please, don't cause a scene." His whisper was soft. "Better than I expected, and heavier than any slap. Please, don't cause a scene." I looked at him and felt something I'd never felt before, stunned disbelief. My boy, asking me to hide. And then she said it, the thing that cut through bone. She raised her glass, laughed, and turned the hall toward me. "Look at him," she said, loud and melodramatic. "How adorable. It's nice he came, even if he can't afford anything new." The word poor landed in the room like a stone thrown at a window. The laughter crashed after it. Shock stunned me first. I remember my throat tightening, as if my voice had been stolen. My hands trembled, but I smiled because I didn't want to give them the sight of me crumbling. Sadness came next, slow, heavy. I saw in my mind the years of midnight shifts, the dinners I skipped so he could eat, the coats I mended, images of him learning to tie his shoes, his first day of school, the night I sold my watch for his medicine, all of it replayed like a bitter slideshow. How could they twist those memories into mockery in a room full of strangers? Disbelief followed. My son laughed along. He didn't stand. He didn't say, "Stop." He lowered his head and looked away. "Dad," he mouthed, not so much a word as a wall thrown between us. I wanted to shout that I was his father, but the noise swallowed me. The room blurred. Plates, flowers, the soft buzz of conversation, all of it became distant. I felt like I was underwater, and every breath was a fight. Anger rose slow and hot, like a furnace firing up. First a dull ache in my jaw, then the heat behind my eyes. I kept my hand steady on the fork because the idea of breaking something in front of them felt exactly like giving them what they wanted. I remembered every time I had shown up for him. Parent-teacher meetings, midnight drives to the ER, the scholarships lined up because I worked 2 jobs. How dare they, I thought. How dare they reduce a lifetime to the fold of my jacket? Her words echoed, "Poor," repeated in different languages in my head until it sounded ridiculous in Mons. Trows all at once. A guest leaned over and smirked. "Maybe he's the help." Another murmured, "He should go sit with the vendors." My son's hand found mine under the table for a second, a phantom touch of the boy he used to be, then pulled away. That small abandonment cut deeper than the public humiliation. It told me his allegiance had shifted. Humiliation burned into me, the kind that collects and never washes out. I could feel the eyes like a microscope, picking apart my life. I wanted to tell them about the nights I stayed awake, knitting our future out of overtime and thrift store bargains. I wanted to tell them the truth, that everything they revered had roots in my sacrifice. Instead, I sat still, heart pounding, watching them celebrate my supposed insignificance. Each laugh was a ledger entry against me. By the time the cake was cut and the music swelled, disbelief had hardened into something else, a cold, clear resolve. I left the ballroom later that night with my head held up, even though my knees felt weak. They thought they'd broken me with words. They had only revealed who they were. The betrayal wasn't a single act. It was a series of choices. To exclude, to mock, to prefer appearances over a man who raised a son to manhood. And as I drove home in the dark, the anger didn't fade. It settled into my bones like a vow. I would not be invisible any longer. I stood alone by the patio doors, the night air hitting my face like a slap, and for the first time in years, the world felt unbearably small. My hands still smelled faintly of the cologne I wore because I wanted to look presentable for my son, a small dignity I kept for him. I watched them through the glass, laughter, light, clinking glasses, all the noises of a life that had slowly drifted away from me. Grief washed over me first, thick and familiar, the old ache that had lived in my chest since my wife died. It was the same grief I felt the night I sold her watch for his medicine, the same grief that sat beside me at cheap diner tables. But tonight, grief came with a new weight, humiliation folded into it like a second wound. I replayed every insult in my head like someone dragging a needle across a record. Poor, the bride had said. I felt the sting of strangers' eyes, the clipped whisper of my son's request. Don't cause a scene. At first the urge was to curl up and disappear, to pretend their words were rain and let them wash off. Then the memory of all the small killings of my dignity, the times I swallowed pride so he wouldn't worry, rose up. I had given him the last of my shirts, my nights, my weekends. I had given him my very name, polished and worn, so he could walk proud. And when it mattered most, he let someone else define me with a single, careless word. Something inside me tightened, not a breaking but a knot that pulled everything straight. I thought about the nights I walked the construction site at dawn, the calloused hands I used to build a better tomorrow. I thought about the way his face once lit up when I came home with something small, a comic book, a hot dog, and how I had learned to be content with those fireworks. Anger began as a slow burn. It didn't roar suddenly. It kindled, then fed on years of being overlooked. I followed the path of my feelings, shock, then sorrow, then a hot, disciplined fury that did not seek to destroy for sport, but to correct an injustice. You will not make me invisible, I told myself, low and steady, as if practicing a line in a play I'd never wanted to star in. The grief softened into resolve. The humiliation sharpened into strategy. I remembered the offers I'd declined, the late-night calls to lawyers when I was checking on small print rather than applause. It wasn't money I craved to prove. It was respect. The two had been tangled for too long, but tonight the knot came undone. I could feel the years of sacrifice align like stones. In a wall, strong and deliberate, each memory became a brick beneath my feet. My mind started mapping possibilities, not out of malice, but from a careful, quiet place of consequence. No screams, no scandal, only truth delivered with precision. They would see the measure of me by my actions, not their whispered judgments. I pictured the look on their faces when the ledger matched the lifetime they'd so casually misread. I imagined silence swallowing the laughter. The decision settled into me like a bone set straight. I would not beg for dignity. I would reclaim it. I would show them by doing what I had always done silently, using what I had built to rewrite the story they told about me. So I turned from the window and walked away from their lights as if leaving a stage after a poor performance, not defeated, not broken, calm, and very, very resolved. I felt the old soft part of me, the man who made pancakes and mended sleeves, stand beside this new edge of steel. Enough is enough, I whispered into the dark, and the words sounded like a verdict and a promise. I vowed then, with every quiet muscle in my body, that I would not be dismissed, I would not be laughed at, and I would make sure they remembered my name for something other than a punchline. I did not let anger rush me into anything reckless. Revenge, I decided, would be surgical, slow, careful, and indisputable. First I went home and dug through the quiet life I'd built. Old contracts, dusty folders, the files I'd kept locked in the bottom drawer. I had no need to shout. I had paperwork, signatures, small investments tucked away from sight, the kind of things you forget until they suddenly matter. I called an old friend from the title company I used to deal with and asked a question that sounded innocent. "Do you still handle property closings?" He laughed, then listened. He became my first ally, though. He one who could look without being looked at. Next came the accountant, the man who'd balance books when I was building that stubborn little company. He owed me nothing, but he understood debt of a different kind, loyalty. We met in a diner at dawn, the kind of place where no one remembers faces. Over coffee, I slid a sealed envelope across the table. He read, nodded once, and his eyes said all I needed. I started small, confirming ownership trails, tracing the sale of the venue where they'd laughed. I learned how easily names could be shuffled through shell companies if you let strangers talk to strangers. I learned where people assumed secrecy but didn't verify. There were quiet phone calls to a paralegal I'd once helped land a job. She dug into public records and dropped documents on my porch in the night like a secret breadcrumb trail. I paid attention to timing, tax cycles, corporate meeting dates, trust fund clauses. Every calendar tick became a potential opening. My lawyer, a patient man who'd once represented me in a minor dispute, drafted options without fanfare. Transfers, trusts, revocations, conditions that would bloom at my signal. I tested the edges of what could be done legally and ethically, because the last thing I wanted was to sink to their level of cheap cruelty. I practiced my face in the mirror for weeks, not to deceive, but to hold the calm while the machine behind the calm did its work. I wore the same jacket to grocery stores and parades, to intersections where I might be seen but not noticed, a mask of ordinariness. Sometimes I left small, deliberate crumbs, an offhand comment about settling some old accounts, a payphone call placed where someone could overhear. Those hints were tiny and tasteless to most, but they made my son's new friends curious, and the bride's family glance up from their champagne. Behind those crumbs, contracts were signed, accounts quietly consolidated, but a trust was put in place. Nothing flashy, invisible to anyone who expected drama instead of footwork. I recruited helpers who understood discretion, the bank manager who remembered my first deposit, the contractor who owed me a favor, the paralegal who wanted to do something honorable for the man who'd helped her when she was down. They worked in hushed rooms with lists and stamps while I pretended to watch TV and read the newspaper like any retired man might. I made sure every transaction had a paper trail only I and a handful of loyal, competent people could trace. No gossip, no leaks, just cold documents and precise timing. There were nights I sat at my kitchen table, lamp on, going through deeds until my eyes blurred, mapping when transfers could be executed to cause maximum clarity rather than chaos. I never let them suspect that the man they mocked carried the power to change their world. Instead, I practiced patience. I rehearsed the moment I would speak, what I would say first, what papers I would slide across a table, how I would keep my voice steady as I watched their faces fall apart. But I also planned softer moves, a note left years earlier that would become meaningful when unfolded at the right time, a trust fund set with a name they'd never expect. I imagined using the mansion for something good, not just to punish, a shelter, a place to teach dignity, because I wasn't interested in cruelty. I wanted justice and a rewrite. Every morning I woke with the tiny satisfaction of another checked box, another ally in place, another innocent question asked that revealed a file or a loophole. I counted down in my head not to a day of spectacle, but to the day when facts would speak louder than insults. People like them think revenge needs thunderous entrance and public humiliation. I planned for silence and the lethal clarity of evidence laid bare. When friends asked what I was doing with my time, I smiled and said, "Worrying about the garden." Nobody believed how literal that was. I'd been tending a careful garden of deeds and papers. There were moments I almost revealed everything. A burning temptation to call my son and say, "Do you remember?" But I held back. Patience was my weapon, and secrecy its sheath. The less they knew, the sharper the lesson would land. So I continued to meet, sign, seal, and wait, to let the machinery of years turn slowly toward the verdict I had in mind. And though I confided bits to a few faithful people, the full shape of my plan remained a quiet thing tucked under my ribs. They would see it all at once, and when they did, the question on everyone's lips would be simple and hungry. What exactly had I been planning all along? I chose a quiet evening, not a shouting match, because I had learned that precision wounds deeper than noise. I invited them to dinner at a small private room in a restaurant they wouldn't expect me to use, intimate, neutral, full of witnesses who would not be moved by theatrics. They arrived smug, hand in hand, already rehearsing their pity. They had no idea my calm was a weapon. I sat between my lawyer and the accountant, each face a rock of composure. I folded my napkin like a man setting a table for fate. I began with a story. Not of money, but of memory. The day I bought the land where the company started, the hammer I used to anchor beams, the name of the first clerk who took a chance on me. Their eyes glided over me like they always did. Then I slid the first paper across the table. A deed. "Do you recognize this?" I asked softly. She glanced, scoffed. "It's a venue. So?" That "so" was the first of their mistakes. My lawyer explained calmly how property transfers work, how shell companies can cloak a buyer, and how a sale signed under an alias still holds when the documents are clean. Their smiles froze. The bride's father blanched. His hand combed through his hair like a man trying to erase the paper trail. I let the silence sit, heavy for a long beat, then opened another folder. Bank statements, share certificates, trust documentation. "This," I said, "is the trust you assumed I could never build. $53 million, established years ago, untouched and growing." Shock cracked across the table. The bride stuttered a denial, but the accountant produced a ledger showing the exact shares and dividends. I watched the color drain from the faces that had mocked me months before. They had expected a humbled man. They got a ledger and a lawyer. Then I revealed the clause they'd never seen coming, a simple condition in the trust. Any beneficiary who publicly humiliated or attempted to erase the donor's dignity forfeited access. The room exhaled a collective gasp. Her hand flew to her mouth. My son's jaw slackened, like a man waking from a bad dream. The twists kept coming, because I had planned them to be dominoes. My paralegal ally produced a copy of the venue sale contract, showing how the bride's family had, in haste and arrogance, sold the property months earlier to an LLC I controlled. "You sold our family's property?" her father sputtered, as if ownership was an emotion you could revoke with indignation. "Yes," I said. "You sold it to cover a short-term cash flow problem. You did it without verifying the buyer. I bought what you thought you were selling to someone else." They tried legal threats, blustered about fraud, but every paper I produced was airtight. Timestamps, signatures, banking confirmations. Theirs was the sloppy arrogance of people who assume money buys competence. Then I cut the final thread. The financial support I had quietly planned for my son. Education funds, a startup loan, a small inheritance I'd intended as a cushion. I revoked. My lawyer read the amendment aloud. "Because of gross disrespect and public humiliation, all discretionary distributions of bénéfices resuspended until the beneficiary demonstrates genuine remorse and reconciliation." The bride reeled. The groom's face, my son's face, went ashen. He looked at me with the small, desperate look of a boy who'd been loved into a man, and then forgot the hands that polished him. But I wanted truth, not spectacle. So I added a sting that struck at their pride. The mansion where they danced would no longer be a palace for their parties. I announced, quietly but firmly, that I would repurpose it into a shelter and training center for single parents and people starting over, the very people they'd sneered at. Their outrage was immediate, impotent, and deeply satisfying. The hall of their triumph would become a place for the kind of dignity they scorned. As the nights and weeks unfolded, the consequences multiplied in ways I had not advertised, but had anticipated. Word spread through their social circle. A few investors who'd liked the bride's father's deals began asking awkward questions about the quick sale of the venue. An investigative reporter, tipped anonymously by someone who wanted to see arrogance meet accountability, dug into the rushed sale and uncovered sloppy paperwork that embarrassed the bride's father in public. He had to explain his decision on a local business show. His face, once flushed with certainty, now spoke of panic. The couple's social invitations dwindled. The guests who once toasted their names now avoided their calls. People do not like to stand on the wrong side of a ledger. My son tried to bargain and plead in private, but apologies offered under pressure felt brittle. He sought forgiveness the way a drowning man grasps a plank, frantically, too late. I listened to him, held the memory of his scraped knees and triumphant smiles, and I forgave. But forgiveness did not mean I returned the money or the status. I gave him space to learn humility. Surprises continued to unfold. The bride, who had flaunted a designer neck, lace the night she called me poor, discovered it was a lease-to-own piece tied to a questionable line of credit. Her creditors, once friendly at galas, became worried. The husband's job offers dwindled. Whispers followed him into rooms where deals were made. Karma, if it exists, often travels by paperwork and reputation. They came to the mansion's gates months later, pleading for a private pardon. I opened the doors, but only to show them the children learning trades, the parents getting counseling, the faces of people who'd been given a second start. I let them see, without words, what dignity looked like when offered without arrogance. In the end, the punishment that cut deepest was not bankruptcy or social exile alone. It was the slow, public unmasking of the values they'd chosen. I did not humiliate with cruelty. I unrolled facts, offered alternatives to redemption, and made the world watch as their choices bore fruit. They were exposed in boardrooms and living rooms alike, not by scandal, but by consequence, the kind of consequence that clings to reputation like a shadow. When people asked why I had done it, I answered simply, to teach respect, to reclaim what had been reduced to a joke, and to give the mansion back to those who understood its true value. By the time the dust settled, the bride's laughter had been replaced by quiet, awkward conversation. My son had learned to sit without pretending, and the family that had dismissed me discovered how thin the line is between boasting and ruin. I had not sought to destroy them, only to show them the mirror their cruelty refused to hold. And standing in the new shelter's doorway months later, watching former guests of honor learn a skill and feed their children, I felt something like peace, fierce, earned, and clean. When the storm finally quieted, I found myself alone again. Not the lonely kind that eats at you, but the kind that gives you space to breathe. The mansion, once filled with laughter that wasn't mine, now echoed with the soft chatter of people rebuilding their lives. Every morning I walked the halls hearing drills, laughter, and hope replacing music and gossip. The ballroom where my son's bride once called me poor now served as a classroom. The chandeliers shone over determination instead of arrogance. At first I thought revenge would heal me completely, that the moment I saw them fall, I'd feel whole again. But life has a strange way of humbling even those who deliver justice. The satisfaction was real, sharp and powerful, yet underneath it there was something else, sorrow. Because in teaching them a lesson, I'd also learned how easily love can decay when pride takes root. My son came to see me one evening, not with excuses this time, but with humility in his eyes. He stood by the gate for a long time before I walked out to meet him. "Dad," he said quietly, "I was blinded, and I lost the one person who truly believed in me." His voice cracked, and for the first time since the wedding, I saw my boy, not the man who'd humiliated me. I put a hand on his shoulder and told him the truth. "You didn't lose me. You lost your way. Now you have to earn your way back." We stood there, not as enemies, but as two men learning how forgiveness works when trust is broken. He offered to volunteer at the shelter to help the people his wife once looked down on. I didn't stop him. Sometimes redemption isn't about words, it's about showing up day after day with quiet shame and honest work. The bride, I heard, left town after their marriage began to crumble. She couldn't live with the whispers or the weight of her own choices. I didn't rejoice in her downfall. Truthfully, I pitied her. Because greed rots faster than guilt, and hers had already eaten through whatever goodness she once had. Now, When I look back on it all, I don't see myself as the hero or the victim, just a man who refused to be erased. I had spent a lifetime giving, forgiving, and being overlooked. The revenge wasn't about money. It was about reclaiming dignity that no price tag could define. The mansion stands as proof that wealth means nothing without heart. And so, as I sit by the window each evening, watching the sunset bleed over the estate, I whisper to myself, they called me poor because they couldn't see the richness of character, love, and endurance within me. I smile, knowing that the greatest luxury is peace, and I finally have it. If there's one lesson I'd want anyone to take from my story, it's this. Never measure a person by what they wear, drive, or own. Measure them by what they've endured and still manage to give. Because pride fades, money burns, and youth vanishes. But respect, once earned, becomes eternal. And as for me, I may have lost a son for a while, but I gained something rarer, the strength to rise, the peace to forgive, and the wisdom to never let cruelty go unanswered again. That, more than $53 million, is my true inheritance,